Greetings, everybody. It's Patricia Berry. Thank you for joining me again to talk a little bit. In this experience, I'm going to actually talk about something a little bit different than fundraising. So I'm joined today by the talented Yan Azzaro from thepaperpusher.co. And Yan has generously agreed to do a visual conversation as I tell a story about my why. And in any organization, any client that I work with, one of the first things that we delve into is, why are you doing this work? And my why is very special to me because my why has everything to do with my grandma. So my Oma Frida was an immigrant from Germany. When she was very young, she came from Germany. And when I was growing up in Idaho, she was an important part of my life. And her example as kind of this very stealth, badass German lady who just didn't take any shit, but was still just, she was about 4'0" and very slight. And by time I was 10 or 11, had totally white hair, and just, looked like she would be the sweetest little lady ever invented. But I'll tell you, you did not wrangle with her because she would make sure that the right thing happened. So she was such an inspiration for me growing up, that when I think about why I went into fundraising and why I lean so heavily into really values-driven fundraising and fundraising that is all about mission and all about the things that inspire you, I think about stories about my grandmother. And one of the great stories that I really loved about her, just to kind of give you an example of what a badass she was, she had this Chevy Nova when I was growing up, and she was already a white-haired old lady by this time. And the Chevy Nova was from the 70s, I think. I'm not sure exactly what the year is, but traditionally, the Chevy Nova is a muscle car. It's the thing that young people get so they can soup up, they can paint it awesome colors, they can make it really loud, and they can drag race on, a Saturday night in their Chevy Nova. So my grandmother, not understanding any of that culture, had this Chevy Nova. It was a white Chevy Nova. It had no power steering and no power brakes. It was the car that I learned to drive on, and I will tell you that you had to have some muscles to drive this car with no power steering. I mean, I don't think in this day and age we understand what that's like. But here's this very slight, tidy old German lady driving this Chevy Nova. And whenever we would go places, we would park the car, and inevitably we would come back and there would be a note under the window from some young gentleman that wanted to buy the car from her because he had a plan for how to turn it into a really awesome muscle car. But again, my grandmother was totally not interested. And so imagine me at about 10 or 11 years old, sitting in the car. My grandmother was driving me someplace. I don't know where. And she was going kind of her normal stately pace down the street. And there was some young man in a car behind us that really felt like she was not going fast enough. And he was tailgating us and he was honking at her. And my grandmother was just very, I admired how cool she was, with this guy kind of breathing down her neck. And so what he did was, when we pulled up at the stoplight, he pulled up right next to her and he shouts out the window to her, "Go to hell, or go home, old lady." And she, without missing a beat, just turns around and looks at him and she says, "Go to hell, young man." And without, turning a hair, without looking angry, she just drove off at her standard stately pace. And that is a story that I often think about just how to hold your ground, essentially in your truth, and not let anybody kind of push you around. So this example of my grandmother, time and time again, these are the kind of stories that I had from and about her. And we had all sorts of stories from the family of what it was like to grow up with her. And she never confirmed or denied anything. She really had very little interest in looking at the past or dwelling on the past. She was always very much in the now, and she was always very much in what's next. And no matter what kind of difficulties she went through, as we, when I was a kid, we heard stories about what it was like to grow up during the Depression and what her life was like. She never dwelled on any of that. It was a part of her. It was a part of what formed her, but she was really not interested in rehashing it. She always wanted to look to the future. So a lot of the stories that I have about her early days are from my family members. And the one I want to share with you today is one that my Uncle Terry would tell us. And this was about when she first came from Germany. She was in her teens. I'm not sure exactly how old she was, but she's still a young woman. And her and her family emigrated from Germany. And they ended up settling in Oregon, where she met essentially this guy who was like the wealthiest guy in this very small train town. It was a town called Baker, Oregon. And she met and married a gentleman named Kenneth Moody. And Kenneth and his family were kind of the young princes of this very small train town in Baker, Oregon. They had cattle, they had a lot of land. They were, certainly big fish in a small pond, but, did very well. And so Kenneth and Frida met and got married. And she, in her early 20s, now has a husband and 4 children under the age of, I think, 6. They were all fairly close together. And they're living with Kenneth's mother, whose name was Bertha. And by all accounts, Bertha was a complicated woman to love and was not necessarily the easiest companion. Well, when the Depression hit, the family lost everything. The cattle business went belly up. They had multiple properties and holdings. They had to sell them all, lost everything in the crash, ended up with no savings, very little resources. And the whole family was now living in the last of their properties, which was a home, which was fairly large, on one of the main streets. So Kenneth, who, like a lot of men during the Depression, couldn't find work in his hometown because there was really no industry. Everything had closed or crashed. So he went a couple states away, and he went to find work essentially on the docks about 2 states away. And, for whatever reason, I'm sure very complicated living conditions and all sorts of other things, he was not able to send much, if any, money home, and then died shortly after he had gone looking for work elsewhere. So that left Frida, my Oma Frida, with a cantankerous mother-in-law and 4 young children to figure out how they were going to live, how they were going to make all the ends meet. So she made a number of pretty quick decisions. One was they started renting out rooms in their home. I think they provided dinner as well. So it was kind of a really traditional boarding house during the Depression. And still that wasn't quite enough to, keep all the kids fed and the mother-in-law cared for. So Frida also went out to work in a bakery. And she ended up working in bakeries essentially for the rest of her life. And she was very good, particularly at German chocolate cake. That was the one that she would always make for our birthdays. No coincidence, nice German lady. So, working in a bakery, renting out rooms, at times taking in washing, essentially doing whatever it is that she could do to keep everybody fed and clothed and happy. And during that time, so this was, again, Depression era in a small train town, Baker, Oregon, What would happen in train towns is there would be a lot of itinerant workers, commonly known as hobos, who were living on the rails and, kind of living down the train yard, coming and going, migrating as they will. But what that population used to do is they would go up and down the back alleys. So essentially the alley behind a suite of residential houses had a gate, and that was where you went and put, your garbage, and, everything happened, in that alleyway. And what the hobos would do is they would have a series of iconography that would be a note both to themselves as well as to any hobo who was coming after as to what this house was like. So that icon may be something about, you can get a meal here, but first you have to listen to a sermon. You can get food here, but then you have to work for it. One of the ones that I always think about with my grandmother is there's a lovely hobo symbol of a cat. And the cat symbolizes for other hobos that a kind lady lives here. And I love it. My grandmother didn't necessarily have cats, but I just love thinking of my young grandmother as being a person that the hobos feel like is a kind lady who lives here. And one of the reasons is she would always be good for a handout. And she didn't necessarily have enough for an entire meal, but she always had enough to share. She always had a potato or a turnip or something like that. And so, the hobo population had made sure that to do a chalk mark on her gate. Well, the thing that gets me is the story that my Uncle Terry would tell about her having chalk at the back door. And after a rainstorm, she would go look at the gate because she knew that the hobos had drawn symbols on it. She wanted to make sure that the mark was still there. She wanted to make sure that the people who were in need knew that she had enough to share and that was willing to share. And that image of my grandmother with all these kids to feed and this mother-in-law and probably tired from all of the work she has to do keeping up everything, would still make time to ensure that that chalk mark was on the back gate. And how that shows up for me is, what the hobos would do with the things that she would provide, as with a number of other kind people. They would take that potato or that bit of turnip or that cutting of bacon, and it would go down to the train yard to a community soup. And that community soup, everybody would contribute to it, and then everybody would get a bowl. And my grandmother's feeling when I would ask her about this story, she didn't want to confirm or deny or go into too many details. But one thing that she would say is she said that she always wanted to live in abundance. She always wanted to make sure that she had enough to share and that the community would be fed. And there was always a way to do that. And when I think about my work in nonprofit and my concerns about community, I see myself as a person who is just constantly providing whatever little bit I can to the community soup that will hopefully feed and nourish a great deal of people. And that is, so much about my why from my grandmother. I was really delighted when I started my business and I went through a branding program with a really talented local group, that they came out, after hearing multiple stories, some of them about my grandmother, some of them about my work, they came out with a logo that just, I felt like captured all of this for me, that it was a half circle logo. And to me, what I saw was that bowl, that community pot, that both the clients that I'm working with, as well as myself, are adding things to that bowl that create a nourishing dish for everybody that we come in contact with. And there's always enough to share. There's always you know, a spice of knowledge. There's always a broth of community. I see that every time I see my logo. And it really always reminds me deeply of my why, which again has everything to do with my Oma Frida, a badass little German lady who always made sure that she had enough to share. So thank you for listening to this story. Frida's a really special place in my heart, as well as in my outlook. And I've loved sharing it with you. So I look forward to more conversations. Feel free to reach out, but it's been great sharing this time with you. Thanks, Yen. Thank you, everybody.